We'll record that. Here we go. So as we talked on Monday, we talked about the cardiovascular system. We talked about the blood flow through the heart. So right now we're just going to go over it, summarize the blood flow through the heart, right? And this should prepare you for the practical next week. Okay? So first of all, let's review some anatomy, some structures of the heart before we talk about the blood flow. As I said before, we have 4 chambers of the heart. We have 2 atria, right and left, and the 2 ventricles, right and left. And we have the valves also. We have 2 atrioventricular valves, one on the right, one on the left. The one on the right over here is a tricuspid valve, and we have the mitral valve or bicuspid valve. And they're called atrioventricular because they're between the atrium and the ventricle in each side. And we have 2 semilunar valves that separates ventricles from major blood vessels. The first one is a pulmonary valve or pulmonary semilunar valve, all right, between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery or the pulmonary trunk. And we have the aortic semilunar valve is the gate to the aorta. Okay, and we have this major vein, vena cava. We have the superior portion of it, the inferior. As I said, blood comes back to the heart from the head and neck area via the superior vena cava. If we're talking from the lower body, lower extremities, abdomen area, goes back to the right side of the heart via the inferior vena cava. And don't forget about the coronary sinus, coronary sinus, because the heart itself, or the heart cells, the cardiac cells, they require blood supply. Why? Because blood transport oxygen and nutrients. So your heart that serves your entire body with blood, which contains the oxygen and nutrients, very important for each cell. The heart itself needs oxygen and nutrient supplies. Okay? So blood return to the heart via 3 routes: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And it goes where in the right side of the heart? To the right atrium. What type of blood? Returning to the heart. So returning where? Returning from the body tissues, from the body cells, right? Rich in carbon dioxide. It goes back to the heart to be pumped to the lungs where gas exchange occur to get oxygenized. So the blood found in this area over here, right atrium, is deoxygenated blood. Low oxygen, poor oxygen. Okay, so as blood accumulates here, let me check, in the right atrium, pressure will increase in the right atrium. Increase of pressure will push the tricuspid valve open, and we said those valves open one way. Open one way. Go down and start filling the right ventricle. As the pressure increases in the right ventricle, the increase of pressure in the right ventricle due to the filling of the blood will shut the valve, tricuspid valve, close. Don't forget about the, let me just move it. Don't forget about the chorda tendineae that are attached to the papillary muscles. They're anchored to the papillary muscles. Why? To prevent over-closing or opening to the other side. So that will prevent backflow of blood to the right atrium. That should not be. That's not normal. Okay, it's only one-way flow. Here we go. The right ventricle is responsible We're pumping blood to the lungs. Okay? And the pressure of contraction is, of course, low. It's about 40 millimeter per mercury. Why? Because lungs are a short distance. It's not going to your entire body, it's just going to the lungs. It's a short distance. So it doesn't need to be contract forcibly. Okay? That's why we have few myocardium cells over here. Look at how thick it is compared to, or thin it is compared to the left ventricle. Okay? So right ventricle will contract, ejecting the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonic trunk, to the left and right pulmonary veins. Okay? Left and right pulmonary veins. If I draw blood from the pulmonary vein over here, what type of blood is there? Oxygen rich or oxygen poor? It's oxygen poor. But why we call it an artery? The majority of arteries contain oxygen rich blood. Again, we go back to the definition of veins and arteries. A vein, right, is that tube, that structure that carries blood to the heart. An artery carries blood away from the heart. So the left pulmonary artery over here, it's carrying blood outside of the heart, away from the heart. Where? To the lungs. Right? Left and right pulmonary arteries. So therefore it's an artery by definition. Okay. So what happened in the lungs? What happened is gas exchange. Right? Gas exchange between the alveoli, and we'll talk about next week, or we started later on today. The alveoli, those air sacs that are found in the lungs, and each lung contains millions of them, right? Surrounded by capillaries. And we know from last lecture, capillaries contain what? Endothelial cells, very simple epithelial cells, right? So things will move in and out simply, simple diffusion. So gas exchange occur in the lungs. The lungs don't pump blood to the body. It's not their job. So the blood has to return back to the heart. Okay? So blood will return, circulate back. And before we talk about that, what type of circulation is this called? From the right side of the heart, right ventricle to the lung. It's the pulmonary circuit. It's a short circuit. Sure? So blood returns back to the left side of the heart. This is the left, this is the right side of the heart. Via the left and right pulmonary veins. If I ask you, if I take this vein over here, draw blood from this vein, what type of blood is in there? Is it oxygen rich or oxygen poor? You would say it's oxygen rich, because it's already coming back from the lungs. But why it's not an artery? Simply because that blood vessel is carrying blood to the heart. So it's a vein. Okay? So blood returns, oxygenated blood returns from the lungs after the gas exchange that occurred in the lungs to the left side of the heart, specifically to the left atrium, via the left and right pulmonary veins. We have left and right lungs, right? Therefore, we have right and left pulmonary veins. As blood starts to fill the left ventricle, the left atrium, blood pressure will increase. The increase of blood pressure will open the valve. What is this valve called? Bicuspid valve. As I talked last time, don't get confused between bicuspid and tricuspid. Where's tricuspid here? So if you get confused, always remember, try before you buy. Try before you buy. Except if it's food, don't try it. You'll pay for it, right? So if it's food, don't try. Pay first. Buy, then try. But if we're talking clothes, if you go to Kohl's or JCPenney, right? You try before you buy. So tricuspid before bicuspid. Okay, here we go. Maybe it's an easier way to remember. Again, blood goes down to the left ventricle, start to fill the left ventricle. That's what we call the filling time. Okay, blood pressure will increase in the left ventricle. That will shut the bicuspid or mitral valve close to prevent backflow of blood to the left atrium, which should not be. Okay, that's not normal. That's abnormal if that happens. And there's some circumstances where, yes, it will happen, but we can talk about that later, right? Due to some conditions and diseases or problems. The left ventricle is going to pump the blood to the aorta, to this tough artery, considered the largest artery, right? Considered the largest artery in the body. So the contraction here will be with force, with greater force, much more than the right side. Okay, the right side, we said it's about the force of the pressure of the contraction, or the blood pressure over there is about 40 millimeter per mercury, and the left side is about 120 millimeter per mercury. Okay, any questions so far? Any questions? No questions? We'll just move on then. Here we go. Okay, so as the left ventricle contracts with force, forcibly contract, it will eject the blood through the aortic valve to the aorta. The blood speed here is in great force, in greater force. Why? Because the blood is going to your whole body, and we call that the systemic circulation or systemic circuit, and that's why we have thicker myocardium, right? Because we need much force. Now I want you, don't confuse about the amount of blood. The amount of blood, and this is very important, the amount of blood ejected from the right ventricle via the pulmonary circuit and the amount of blood ejected to the system through the left ventricle, it's the same. So it's the same amount of blood. The difference is the force of contraction. Okay, just remember that, the force of contraction. So blood will be ejected through the aortic semilunar valve, the aorta. Later on, we're going to talk about some diseases. Okay, some issues or disorders that affect the valves. Okay, like for example, the aortic stenosis. This aortic valve stenosis. Stenosis means narrowing of the valve. What can cause that? What that can cause? Blood to be ejected more or less. So less blood is being ejected, or more blood? Anybody? Less, right? Because now you are narrowing the space here. So that will decrease the cardiac output. We'll talk about that later. What I mean about that. Okay? So blood is injected from the left ventricle to the aorta, and goes down. This is aortic arch, we call that, to the thoracic aorta, to the body. But also, don't forget about your head and neck area. Your head and neck. Now we have the brachiocephalic artery over here. Brachiocephalic artery. We have your left common carotid artery, and we have your left subclavian artery that will ensure blood also goes to your upper extremities. Okay, don't forget about that. This is simply the blood flow through the heart. It's a one-way flow, one-way flow. Any questions about this? Any question? So you guys good to go? Good to go? Excellent.